My name is Scarlett Parker. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my life, people have described me with words like steady, practical, and the reliable one. I've worked in administrative roles, supported other people's plans, and kept family systems running quietly in the background. If you passed me on the street, you probably wouldn't look twice. I've been underestimated often, not because I lack intelligence or awareness, but because I don't announce myself loudly. I don't compete for attention. I listen more than I speak. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about winning, and it's not about destroying anyone. It's about clarity and what happens when silence stops being confusion and becomes choice. What I'm about to tell you happened inside my own family. It began during one of the most vulnerable moments of our lives, when my mother was lying unconscious in a hospital bed, caught between machines and breath. While she was in a coma, my brother used a power of attorney to sell her house. By the time she woke up, the property was already transferred. Legally, cleanly, quietly. There was no shouting when I found out, no dramatic confrontation, no explosive family meeting, just a slow realization that something fundamental had shifted. Not only in how I saw my brother, but in how I understood my place in the family system that had shaped me since childhood. This story follows that shift. It's about how small dismissals stack up over time, how being the reasonable one can turn into being the invisible one, how silence, when misunderstood, becomes a weapon in someone else's hands, and how silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes something else entirely. You won't hear exaggerated villains here. My brother wasn't a cartoon monster. He was competent, confident, and very certain he knew what was best. The system didn't break down loudly. It worked exactly as designed, and that's what made it so disorienting. Over the course of this story, I'll walk you through how I was seen, the role I was expected to play, and the moment I realized that staying quiet didn't mean staying powerless. You'll hear about documents, timing, patience, and restraint. But more than that, you'll hear about psychological reversal, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that finishes its work before anyone realizes a game was being played at all. I'm sharing this not to ask for sympathy and not to inflict pain. I believe stories like this matter because many people live inside similar dynamics, families, workplaces, relationships, where harm doesn't look dramatic enough to be called harm, and control hides behind legality and good intentions. If you've ever been the one people overlooked because you didn't fight loudly for space, if you've ever been told you were too calm to be dangerous, you might recognize parts of yourself here. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and honestly. Have you ever stayed quiet? Not because you didn't see what was happening, but because you were watching? To my family, I was the one who filled in the gaps. If someone needed a form explained, I explained it. If a deadline was missed, I quietly fixed it. If a conversation turned uncomfortable, I softened it, translated it, or redirected it so no one felt embarrassed. I wasn't the loudest voice at the table, but I was the one people expected to be reasonable, calm, available. They didn't say it outright, but I understood my role early. I was useful, not central. My brother, on the other hand, was visible, decisive, the one people deferred to when something needed to be handled. He spoke with certainty, and certainty has a way of sounding like authority, especially in families that value momentum over reflection. When he talked, people listened. When I talked, people nodded, politely, and moved on. It wasn't cruel, that's important to say. No one mocked me. No one raised their voice or told me I didn't matter. The dynamic was quieter than that, more efficient. I was trusted with execution, not direction, with support, not decisions. At family gatherings, I was the one clearing plates while conversations continued without me. At hospitals, offices, and banks, I was the one taking notes while others spoke. I told myself it was fine, that this was just how families balance themselves, everyone playing to their strengths. And for a long time, I believed it. I was proud of being dependable, proud that people could count on me not to panic, not to overreact, not to complicate things with emotion. When our mother got sick, that role intensified. I coordinated schedules, I tracked medications, I made sure the paperwork was organized and accessible. I didn't argue when my brother stepped into the role of spokesperson. It felt natural, almost expected. He had the confidence. I had the details. Looking back, I can see how easily competence turns invisible when it's consistent. People notice chaos. They notice mistakes. They rarely notice the person who prevents both. So when my brother spoke for the family, no one questioned it. When he said he would take care of things, heads nodded. When he asked me to send documents, make copies, and follow up, I did. Efficiently. Quietly. If someone had asked me then whether I felt overlooked, I would have said no. I would have explained it away with logic. Someone has to do the background work. Not everyone needs to lead. This is just how we function best. What I didn't admit, even to myself, was how rarely anyone asked what I thought should happen. Not once did anyone say, "Scarlett, what do you think we should do next?" Not once did anyone pause and say, "Let's hear her perspective." It wasn't hostility, it was an assumption. The assumption that I would adapt, that I would understand, that I didn't need to be consulted because I wasn't likely to object. I had built that reputation carefully by being agreeable, thorough, and calm. Silence, after all, is very easy to misinterpret. When our mother slipped into a coma, everything accelerated. Decisions needed to be made quickly, or so it seemed. Legal authority mattered, access mattered, timing mattered. My brother already had the language of control, confident, firm, reassuring. I had the language of support. No one excluded me outright. They simply moved forward as if I would follow. And I did, at first. I told myself this wasn't about me, that this was about our mother, that there would be time later for conversations, for clarification, for balance. I believed that trust inside a family didn't need to be verbalized. It was just there. But trust, I would later learn, is often assumed in the direction of power. At that stage, though, I still believed in the version of myself they saw. The steady one, the helper, the quiet constant. I didn't challenge it, I didn't correct it, I didn't think I needed to. Because when you've spent your whole life being seen as harmless, you start to believe that nothing important could possibly be happening without you being told. And that belief, that blind spot, was the most dangerous thing I carried into what came next. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive as an argument or a raised voice. It came as a sentence said too casually to be challenged, one of those comments that slides into a conversation and keeps going, leaving you unsure whether it deserves attention. We were standing in the hospital hallway, the kind with pale floors and no windows, where time feels suspended. My brother was on the phone, speaking in that efficient tone he used when he wanted to sound capable. I was holding a folder, medical updates, insurance notes, everything I'd been organizing since our mother was admitted. He ended the call, looked at me briefly, and said, "I've taken care of the legal side. We're covered." That was it. "No, we should talk about it, or I want your input." Just a conclusion, already finalized. I remember nodding, almost automatically. Years of habit kicked in before curiosity did. Good, I thought. One less thing to worry about. But something lingered. I asked what he meant, lightly, carefully, the way you do when you don't want to seem suspicious. He said he'd activated the power of attorney, that he'd spoken with a lawyer friend, that everything was standard. Standard is a powerful word. It shuts down questions without answering them. I remember asking whether I should have copies of whatever had been signed. He smiled, not unkindly, and said, "You don't need to worry about that. I've got it." It wasn't the words, it was the tone. Final, efficient, protective, even, as if my concern was unnecessary friction. No one else in the hallway reacted. Nurses passed, phones rang. Life continued around us, indifferent. If there was a moment to pause, to push back, to insist on clarity, it slipped by quietly. That was the first small cut. At the time, I didn't label it as such. I told myself I was overthinking, that I was tired, that stress was making me sensitive. After all, our mother was unconscious. Surely this wasn't the moment to question motives or dynamics. So I did what I always did. I stored the moment away. I noticed how quickly the phrase, "I've got it," began to appear. He used it with doctors, with extended family, with me. Each time it landed the same way, a closed door disguised as reassurance. I asked once, gently, what decisions were being made under the power of attorney. He replied with generalities: medical access, financial continuity, house stuff, always vague, always framed as temporary, always implied that details weren't necessary. Everyone else seemed relieved. One person in charge, one voice, one plan. In a crisis, that can feel comforting. I remember standing in our mother's empty kitchen a few days later, making coffee I didn't want, looking around at the house she'd lived in for decades. Every object felt heavier than usual. This place held her life, her choices, her sacrifices. I texted my brother, asking whether there were any plans regarding the house while she was still unconscious. His response came quickly: "Don't worry, nothing you need to handle." There it was again, nothing you need to handle. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because it was harsh, but because it was accurate in a way that unsettled me. I had been so consistent in handling what I was assigned that I hadn't noticed how narrow that assignment had become. Still, I didn't confront him. I didn't escalate. I didn't accuse. I told myself I was being responsible by staying calm, by trusting the process, by not adding tension. But trust, I was learning, requires visibility. And visibility was something I had quietly given up over years of being agreeable. The cut was small enough to ignore. So small that if I mentioned it, I worried I'd sound paranoid, dramatic, emotional. So I did what I had always done. I stayed quiet. I remembered it, but I stayed quiet. And that was exactly what allowed the next cut to come deeper. After that first moment, the pattern settled in so smoothly that it almost felt intentional. Not as a plan, but as momentum. Decisions were made elsewhere, then summarized for me later. Sometimes not even summarized, just implied. Conversations happened in rooms I wasn't in, on calls I wasn't included on. When I asked questions, the answers were brief and reassuring, designed to calm rather than inform. And because I didn't push back, because I kept my tone neutral and my posture cooperative, everyone assumed I was comfortable with it. I began to notice how often my brother used time as a shield. There wasn't time to loop everyone in. This needed to be done quickly. We can talk about it later. Later became a flexible concept, always available in theory, never arriving in practice. When I mentioned that I felt a little out of the loop, he laughed softly and said, "You worry too much." Not dismissive enough to argue with, almost affectionate, as if my concern was a personality quirk rather than a reasonable response. Other relatives echoed him without realizing it. "He's handling everything," they'd say with relief. "It's good someone is taking charge." Taking charge, as if no one else was capable. I started to hear the unspoken contrast. He acts, she observes, he decides, she supports. And the dangerous thing was, I let that narrative stand. I told myself this was just how crises reorganize families, that someone always becomes the center, and someone else becomes the stabilizer. I told myself that my calmness was a strength, not a signal to be bypassed. But there were moments, quiet ones, where discomfort crept in. Like the afternoon, I asked for a copy of the power of attorney document, just to understand its scope. He said he'd send it. He didn't. When I followed up, he said he'd forgotten, then said it wasn't necessary for me to review it because it was standard boilerplate. Standard again. Each time I let it go. Each time the bar lowered slightly. What once would have felt unacceptable began to feel normal. That's how disrespect works when it's subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It trains you to adjust your expectations downward while convincing you that you're being reasonable. I noticed how my role narrowed further. I was asked to handle logistics, errands, updates, emotional labor. I was the one relatives called when they were anxious, confused, or overwhelmed. I absorbed their fear so my brother didn't have to. And in return, I received reassurance, not information. At night, when things finally went quiet, I'd replay conversations in my head. I'd ask myself whether I was imagining the imbalance, whether I was being unfair, whether this was about ego rather than substance. I had been conditioned to distrust my own discomfort. That conditioning didn't come from cruelty. It came from years of being praised for being easy, for not making things complicated, for being understanding. So when I felt something was wrong, my first instinct wasn't to investigate. It was to rationalize. He's under pressure. He's just trying to help. This isn't the time to question intentions. I told myself that challenging him would create unnecessary conflict, that silence was a form of maturity, that staying calm was the responsible thing to do. What I didn't yet realize was that silence, repeated often enough, stops being maturity and starts becoming permission. The moment that really stayed with me happened during a brief meeting with a hospital administrator. My brother spoke on behalf of the family. I stood beside him holding my notebook. At one point, I clarified a detail about insurance coverage, something I had confirmed earlier that day. The administrator nodded and thanked me. My brother interrupted immediately and corrected me incorrectly. I hesitated. I knew I was right. The document was in my bag. All it would have taken was one sentence. But the room was quiet. Everyone was looking at him. And the old instinct rose up. Don't contradict. Don't slow things down. Don't embarrass him. So I said nothing. Afterward, I showed him the document privately. He glanced at it, waved it off, and said, "Okay, fine, I'll handle it." No apology, no acknowledgement. That was when something shifted inside me. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a subtle awareness that my silence wasn't keeping the peace. It was erasing me. Still, I didn't confront him. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. I didn't announce a boundary. I normalized it. I told myself this was temporary, that once our mother woke up, everything would rebalance, that the system would correct itself. But systems don't correct themselves. They settle into whatever shape they're allowed to hold. And by staying quiet, by continuing to be useful without being visible, I was teaching everyone exactly how little consideration they needed to give me. They didn't notice, but I did. And I didn't forget. Once you see a role clearly, you can't unsee it. Mine wasn't written down anywhere, but it was reinforced in 100 small ways. I was the one expected to adapt, to schedules, to decisions, to outcomes I hadn't been consulted on. I was the one who made things easier for everyone else, even when it cost me clarity. I wasn't the authority, I was the buffer. When extended family asked questions, they came to me, not because I had answers, but because I was safe. I wouldn't overwhelm them. I wouldn't complicate things. I would translate whatever my brother had decided into language that sounded reassuring. I became the interpreter of decisions I hadn't made. At first, I told myself this role mattered, that emotional labor was still labor, that being trusted to calm others was a form of influence, but influence without agency is just maintenance. My brother, meanwhile, grew more comfortable occupying the center. He didn't consult, he informed, he didn't ask for agreement, he assumed it. And because no one challenged him, the assumption hardened into precedent. I started to recognize the pattern in how he spoke to me versus how he spoke to others. With them, he was decisive. With me, he was dismissive, but gently so, wrapped in familiarity. You're overthinking this. Just trust me. I don't want you to stress about things you can't change. Each sentence framed my concern as unnecessary, even unhealthy, as if my desire to understand was a flaw, not a responsibility. And because I didn't raise my voice, because I didn't push, he interpreted my restraint as agreement. There was a moment, quiet, almost forgettable, when the assignment became undeniable. We were sitting in the hospital cafeteria, both of us exhausted. I asked whether any major financial decisions had been made while our mother was still unconscious. I wasn't accusatory, I wasn't emotional. I asked the way someone asks when they genuinely expect transparency. He paused, just for a second, then said, "You don't need to worry about that. I'm handling it." Not we, I. I realized then that my role wasn't to be informed later. It was not interfering now. I wasn't expected to disagree. I was expected to absorb. And the strangest part was how reasonable it all sounded on the surface. After all, someone had to act. Someone had to sign. Someone had to make calls. Efficiency was praised. Speed was rewarded. What wasn't rewarded was caution, or shared decision-making, or the kind of questions that slow momentum. I was assigned the role of the person who would never slow things down. That assignment came with an unspoken condition. My silence was proof of my support. Once I understood that, I saw it everywhere. In how meetings were scheduled without checking my availability, in how updates were delivered after decisions were final, in how my contributions were acknowledged, only when they didn't challenge the direction things were already moving. I was reliable, useful, invisible, and invisibility has a strange effect on self-perception. You start to doubt whether your presence matters at all. You question whether your instincts are valid. You wonder if insisting on clarity would make you difficult. So I stayed careful. I stayed composed. I stayed quiet. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still helped, still organized, still answered calls, still smoothed tensions, but inwardly something was rearranging itself. I began to observe rather than assume, to note patterns instead of excusing them, to listen not just to what was said, but to what was avoided. I noticed how often legal language was used to shut down discussion, how frequently standard procedure replaced explanation, how quickly my brother dismissed anything that suggested shared oversight. And I noticed something else too, something more unsettling. No one seemed to consider how our mother would feel about any of it. Her wishes were referenced abstractly, vaguely, always in alignment with whatever had already been decided. There were no written notes shared with me, no clear record of what she had authorized beyond the existence of the power of attorney itself. I realized then that my role wasn't just invisible, it was convenient. As long as I remained calm and cooperative, the system functioned smoothly. Questions would introduce friction, and friction was the one thing no one wanted. That was the moment I understood the role I had been assigned. And once you understand the role, you face a choice. Continue performing it or step outside of it. I didn't make that choice yet, but I stopped believing the role was accidental. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't come with raised voices or dramatic realizations. It arrived on a day so quiet it would have been easy to forget if it hadn't changed everything. Our mother's room was dim, the blinds half closed against the afternoon light. Machines hummed softly, steady and indifferent. I was alone with her, sitting in the chair beside the bed, watching her breathe. She had been in a coma for weeks by then, long enough for routines to form around her absence, long enough for decisions to be made without her voice. I wasn't there to think. I was there out of habit. I remember noticing her hands. They looked smaller than I remembered, fragile, in a way that made time feel cruel. I held one of them and talked, not because I expected her to hear me, but because silence felt wrong. I told her ordinary things: who had visited, what the doctor said, how the house was still standing, unchanged. That last part mattered to me, though I didn't know why yet. When I left the room, I checked my phone. There was a missed call from an unfamiliar number and a voicemail notification. I listened to it in the hallway, leaning against the wall. It was a real estate office. The message was brief and professional. They were following up regarding a property transfer. They needed confirmation of a document that had been submitted on my mother's behalf. I replayed it twice. Property transfer. My first instinct was denial. There had to be a mistake. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they had the wrong person. After all, no one had mentioned anything about selling the house. I called the number back. Carefully, calmly. I didn't accuse. I didn't panic. I asked clarifying questions. The woman on the other end was polite, efficient. She confirmed the address, confirmed my mother's name, confirmed that the paperwork had been executed under a valid power of attorney. I felt something settle in my chest. Not shock exactly. More like alignment. As if a series of vague discomforts had suddenly arranged themselves into a clear line. I thanked her and ended the call. I didn't call my brother right away. That's what surprised me most. In the past, I would have sought reassurance immediately, asked him to explain, given him the opportunity to smooth it over, to tell me I was misunderstanding. But something about the timing, standing in that hallway, coming straight from our mother's bedside, made that instinct fall away. Instead, I sat down. I thought about the conversations I hadn't been included in, the documents I hadn't seen, the repeated assurances that I didn't need to worry. I thought about how often he had used urgency as justification, how often temporary actions had quietly become permanent. And for the first time, I didn't rush to make the discomfort go away. I let it exist. That was the shift. Not anger, not grief, awareness. I realized that if I confronted him immediately, I would be pulled back into the same role. Reactive, emotional, seeking explanation. The dynamic would reset. He would reassure. I would doubt myself. The system would continue. So I didn't confront. I went home and opened my notebook, the one I had always used for schedules and notes. I started a new page. At the top, I wrote the date. Below it, I wrote exactly what had happened, in plain language. No adjectives, no assumptions, just facts. I noted the voicemail, the confirmation, the address. Then I wrote another date, and another. I began reconstructing a timeline, not emotionally, but methodically, when the power of attorney was mentioned, when documents had been requested, when questions had been deflected. The more I wrote, the quieter my mind became. This wasn't about betrayal in the dramatic sense. It was about the process, about authority, about what had been done while someone was unable to consent. By the time I finished that first timeline, I knew something important. Nothing I was feeling was sudden. The signs had been there all along. I had just been trained not to assemble them. That night, my brother texted me something mundane, an update about visiting hours. I responded normally, calmly, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. I understood now that staying silent didn't mean staying passive. It meant choosing when to speak. And that choice, made quietly, without announcement, was the moment my role began to change. Once the shift happened, silence felt different. Before, it had been reflexive, something I defaulted to in order to keep things smooth. Now it was deliberate, measured, observant. I didn't confront my brother about the house. I didn't ask for explanations or express outrage. From the outside, nothing about my behavior changed. I was still calm, still helpful, still present. That was what made the difference invisible to everyone else. But internally, I had stopped seeking reassurance. I stopped assuming good faith without evidence, and I stopped filling in gaps with excuses. Instead, I paid attention to what my brother volunteered and what he avoided. I noticed how often he framed irreversible decisions as minor steps, how rarely he used specifics, how quickly conversations moved on once he'd delivered his conclusion. And I noticed how comfortable he was with my quiet. My continued composure seemed to confirm something for him, that whatever he was doing, I wasn't a threat to it, that I wouldn't interfere, that I could be managed with vague updates and familiar phrases. That assumption became his blind spot. I began asking questions differently. Not why questions, that invites defensiveness, but when and how questions. Neutral, procedural, the kind that sounds like curiosity, not challenge. When was that document signed? Which office handled the filing? Who's listed as the point of contact? Sometimes he answered, sometimes he deflected. I wrote both down. I also stopped volunteering information. Where I once filled silences with reassurance, I now let them sit. If someone asked me what was happening with the house, I said, I'm not sure yet. That was new, and it made people uncomfortable. But discomfort, I was learning, is not the same as conflict. At night, I continued building my timeline. I organized everything chronologically. I highlighted inconsistencies. I attached copies of emails and texts where I could. I didn't draw conclusions. I didn't speculate. I just documented. There was no anger in it. If anything, there was relief. For the first time, I wasn't trying to convince myself of anything. I was letting the facts speak. The most important change, though, was internal. I stopped trying to be understood. That needed to be seen as reasonable, fair, and calm had kept me quiet for years. It had made me predictable. Once I let it go, my silence became unreadable. My brother mistook that unreadability for agreement. He continued moving forward with confidence. He spoke about the house in the past tense. He referred to outcomes as settled. He assumed no one would question the process because no one had so far. He was right, no one did. Except me. But I wasn't questioning him out loud. I was questioning the structure. The authority, the documentation, the timing. I started learning, quietly, about powers of attorney, about fiduciary duty, about what is allowed, what is assumed, and what is often misunderstood. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this. There was no announcement, no declaration of intent. Silence is underestimated because people assume it contains nothing. In reality, it can contain preparation. There were moments when it would have been easy to break that silence, to accuse, to demand, to force a confrontation, especially when relatives spoke about the house as if it were already gone, as if our mother's life had been neatly wrapped up while she was still alive. Each time I reminded myself, once words are spoken, they can't be taken back. Once emotion enters the room, people stop listening to substance. So I stayed still. I let my brother believe I was coping. I let the family believe everything was handled. I let the system reveal itself without interference. The strangest part was how calm I felt. Not numb, not detached. Calm in the way that comes from finally understanding the terrain you're standing on. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was orienting. I knew I was moving toward something irreversible, but not yet. Timing mattered. Sequence mattered. Silence, when chosen, gives you time. Time to learn, time to prepare, time to let others underestimate you one last time. By the end of that period, I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't doubting my instincts. I wasn't hoping things would resolve themselves. I was waiting. And waiting, I had learned, can be an action. What no one noticed was how much I was paying attention. Because attention, when it's quiet, looks like absence. And absence is easy to dismiss. My brother assumed I had accepted the situation. The rest of the family assumed I was coping in my usual way, by being calm, supportive, and unobtrusive. No one imagined that anything was changing beneath the surface. That was their mistake. I started with the documents. Slowly, carefully, I requested records under neutral pretenses, medical updates, billing statements, administrative confirmations. Each request was reasonable on its own. Nothing raised a suspicion. When I couldn't get copies directly, I noted who had access. When I was told something had been handled, I asked by whom. When dates didn't line up, I marked them. I learned to listen for what wasn't said. If my brother mentioned a lawyer but not a firm, I wrote that down. If he referenced advice but couldn't recall specifics, I wrote that down too. Patterns emerge when you stop explaining them away. I also learned the language he used when he wanted to shut things down. Phrases like "that's standard" and "it's already done" appeared whenever a decision crossed from reversible to final. Those were pressure points. Not emotional ones, but procedural ones. Quietly, I educated myself. I read about fiduciary responsibility, about what a power of attorney allows and what it doesn't, about the difference between acting in someone's best interest and acting for convenience. I learned that legality and ethics often part ways quietly, without conflict. Most importantly, I learned that selling a primary residence while the principal is incapacitated carries weight, especially if it wasn't explicitly authorized. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't assume wrongdoing. I gathered facts. And I noticed something else. There was no record of my mother expressing a desire to sell the house. No emails, no notes, no shared conversations, just an assumption. Assumption, framed as certainty. That certainty had traveled far. The property had been listed, transferred, and processed. By the time my mother regained consciousness, the house was no longer hers. By the time she woke up, the property was already transferred. I remember the day she opened her eyes. The room felt different immediately. Lighter, almost fragile. Relief washed over everyone. Tears, gratitude, promises about the future. No one told her about the house. I watched as my brother spoke to her gently, confidently. He controlled the flow of information, carefully, almost kindly. He focused on her recovery, on rest, on what could wait. And everyone agreed it could wait. Everyone except me. I didn't tell her either. Not then. She was disoriented, weak, overwhelmed. The truth would have landed like a blow. Timing mattered, so I waited. I noticed how quickly my brother shifted from crisis manager to planner. He spoke about the next steps as if they were obvious, how he positioned himself as the one who had already taken care of the hard parts. I noticed how often he referenced it, what mom would want, always aligned with outcomes that benefited his control. And I noticed how comfortable he was with my continued silence. That comfort gave me space. I began documenting interactions after my mother woke up. What she was told, what she wasn't. Who spoke for her. When consent was implied rather than given. I didn't argue. I didn't interrupt. I observed. What they never noticed was that I had stopped needing their validation. I wasn't trying to be included anymore. I was trying to be accurate. Accuracy is dangerous when someone is relying on an assumption. The more I documented, the clearer it became. This wasn't a single decision made under pressure. It was a sequence of choices made without oversight. And oversight, I realized, was the leverage. Not emotionally, structurally. People often think power comes from confrontation, from being loud, from forcing a reckoning. But power also comes from patience, from understanding the rules better than the person who thinks they're in charge. By the time anyone sensed something was off, I had already assembled a full picture. Not a narrative, a record. And records don't argue, they wait. What they never noticed was that while they believed the story was finished, I was still at the beginning. The realization didn't arrive with triumph. There was no rush of satisfaction, no sense of victory. When the final piece clicked into place, what I felt was clarity, clean and quiet, almost sobering. I was sitting at my desk late at night, the house silent, my notebook open in front of me. Pages of timelines, dates, names, and references spread out in a way that finally made sense. Not emotionally, logically. The sale of the house hadn't just been fast, it had been convenient. Convenient in its timing, convenient in its lack of documented consent, convenient in how it bypassed any need for broader agreement. The power of attorney had been used at the widest possible interpretation, one that assumed urgency where there was none and permanence where there should have been caution. And there it was, the leverage, not a secret, not a loophole, a responsibility that had been stretched thin enough to notice. A power of attorney is not ownership, it's stewardship, temporary authority meant to protect, not restructure someone's life while they're unable to speak. What I saw wasn't an obvious violation. It was something more subtle, a pattern of decisions made unilaterally without clear benefit to the person they were supposed to serve. That distinction mattered, because it meant the issue wasn't personal, it was procedural. I didn't feel angry when I understood that. I felt steady, almost relieved. For weeks, I had been carrying the weight of uncertainty, of wondering whether my discomfort was justified. Now I knew it was. This wasn't about my brother being malicious. It was about him being unchecked. I didn't tell anyone. Not my mother, not extended family, not even friends. This wasn't something to process out loud. Talking would have diluted it, turned it into opinion. Instead, I did what I had learned to do best. I organized. I separated what I knew from what I could prove. I labeled assumptions clearly and set them aside. I focused on documentation, signed forms, dates of incapacity, timelines of recovery. I noted how quickly the house had been transferred after the power of attorney was activated. I noted the absence of any documented emergency that would have required such speed. I noted the lack of consultation with anyone else acting in my mother's interest. I also noted something else, something quieter, but just as important. Once the house was sold, my brother's behavior changed. He was more relaxed, less defensive. He spoke as if the hardest part was over. He treated the outcome as settled, irreversible. That told me everything. People who believe they've crossed the finish line stop watching the ground beneath them. The private reveal wasn't that I could confront him. It wasn't that I could expose him. It was that I didn't need to do either to change the outcome. What I had was not a weapon. It was a position. I could choose silence and let things stand. I could confront and create chaos. Or I could move, quietly, within the structure he had assumed no one else understood. I spent days thinking through the implications. What would help my mother? What would harm her? What would protect her dignity rather than satisfy my sense of justice? That was the line I refused to cross. This wasn't about punishing my brother. It was about restoring balance, without turning the situation into a spectacle. When my mother was strong enough, I asked her careful questions, not leading ones, not accusatory ones. I asked about her understanding of what had happened while she was unconscious. She was confused, surprised, hurt, but mostly disoriented. She had not known the house was sold. She had not authorized it explicitly. She had assumed, like everyone else, that decisions were temporary, protective, reversible. I didn't tell her everything I knew. I didn't overwhelm her. I simply listened. That conversation confirmed what the documents already had. The private reveal was complete, and with it came a decision I couldn't undo once made. Because once you act on clarity, you can't go back to innocence. I knew whatever came next would change the family dynamic permanently, even if no one ever raised their voice, even if nothing dramatic happened. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about control over your own timing, and my timing was approaching. Once clarity arrives, hesitation becomes a choice. I had everything I needed laid out in front of me, facts separated from feelings, Documentation separated from interpretation. The situation no longer felt overwhelming, it felt precise, and precision demands a decision. There were several paths open to me. I could confront my brother directly, sit him down, lay out what I knew, and demand accountability. That option promised emotional release, maybe even an apology, but it also promised resistance, denial, justification, and most importantly, it would alert him that the ground beneath him was no longer solid. I could go public within the family, call a meeting, force the issue into the open, let pressure do the work. That option might have created support, but it would also create chaos. Lines would be drawn. My mother would be caught in the middle, forced to process a conflict she wasn't ready for. Or I could do nothing. Let the sale stand, let the discomfort fade, let time turn something wrong into something accepted. That option was the easiest in the short term, and the most damaging in the long run. It would confirm the role I had spent my life inhabiting, the one who absorbs loss quietly so others don't have to feel consequences. There was one more option. It was slower, less visible. And once started, it couldn't be reversed. I could act within the structure itself. I could move not as a sister, not as an emotional counterweight, but as someone acting deliberately in my mother's interest, using the same systems my brother believed only he understood. That option required restraint. It required patience. It required me to continue appearing exactly as I always had, invisible. I spent days weighing the impact, not on my pride, not on my anger, on my mother. She was recovering physically, but cognitively, she was still fragile. Shock would set her back. Stress would undermine her healing. Whatever I did had to protect her, not enlist her. That meant no confrontation, no dramatic revelation, no forcing her to choose sides. The decision point then wasn't about whether to act. It was about how quietly I chose the irreversible path. I didn't tell my brother. I didn't warn him. I didn't signal that anything was changing. I continued responding to messages normally. I showed up when expected. I played the role flawlessly. But behind the scenes, I began setting things in motion, carefully, methodically, without emotion. Once you choose silence as a strategy, you must commit to it fully. Any slip, a hint of accusation, a change in tone can give everything away. I reminded myself of that daily. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about correcting a process that had gone unchecked because no one thought I would notice, much less understand it. The moment I committed to that path, something unexpected happened. The fear disappeared. Not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because indecision had been heavier than action. I knew what I was doing and why, I knew the cost, and I accepted it. Families like to believe harmony is the highest good. But harmony that depends on silence is just an imbalance wearing a polite face. I wasn't seeking to expose my brother. I was seeking to make sure the story didn't end with my mother losing a piece of her life without ever having a say. That line mattered to me. Once crossed, it demanded a response. So I crossed it quietly. The decision was made. And from that moment on, everything I did would look exactly the same to everyone else. Until it didn't. Once the decision was made, I became very careful with my energy. I didn't rush. I didn't multitask emotionally. I treated what I was doing the same way I treated everything important in my life. Slowly, methodically, without performance. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still answered my brother's calls. I still updated relatives when asked. I still accompanied my mother to follow-up appointments. If anyone was watching closely, which they weren't, they would have seen the same calm, cooperative version of me they had always known. That consistency was essential. Behind that surface, though, I began moving piece by piece, never more than one step ahead. I contacted professionals quietly, not to accuse, not to dramatize, but to ask procedural questions, hypothetical ones, neutral ones. What typically happens if a principal regains capacity after a transaction? How is best interest evaluated when consent was assumed rather than documented? What options exist that minimize disruption for the principal? I didn't frame anything as a complaint. I framed it as concern for the proper process. Process opens doors. Emotion never can. I gathered certified copies. I requested timelines. I clarified who had authority at which exact moments. I learned the language of reversibility, mitigation, and fiduciary review. No one pushed back because I wasn't pushing. What I was doing didn't look like resistance. It looked like due diligence, and due diligence is rarely questioned. I was careful not to act faster than the system could absorb. Every request I made had a purpose. Every conversation I had was documented afterward, not with commentary, just notes. My brother remained relaxed. He spoke casually about the future, about plans, about how things had worked out. His confidence grew as time passed, not realizing that time, properly used, was no longer on his side. The most delicate part was my mother. I shielded her from unnecessary detail. I didn't tell her what I was doing, not because she wouldn't understand, but because she didn't need the burden. Healing requires stability, not moral dilemmas. I asked her questions occasionally, gently, about her intentions, her priorities, what the house had meant to her. I listened more than I spoke. Those conversations mattered, not emotionally, but contextually. They became part of the record. Moving in silence requires discipline. There were moments when I wanted to say something, to correct an assumption, to challenge a statement, to reclaim space. Each time I reminded myself, visibility now would cost me leverage later. So I stayed small, agreeable, predictable. People underestimate predictability. They assume it means stagnation. In reality, it can be camouflage. Weeks passed, then more. The situation seemed to settle into permanence. Relatives stopped asking questions. My brother stopped explaining. Everyone believed the story was complete. That's when systems are most vulnerable, when attention fades. I took one final step quietly, one that didn't announce itself as a turning point. I requested a formal review, not as an accusation, but as a clarification of authority, framed entirely around my mother's recovered capacity and expressed wishes. The language mattered. Everything was framed as protective, not corrective. I didn't demand a reversal. I didn't threaten exposure. I simply placed the facts in the correct order and let the process respond. Once that was done, there was nothing more for me to do. Silence returned, but this time it wasn't empty, it was complete. I waited. And when you move correctly within a system, you don't need to announce consequences. They arrive on their own. The first sign wasn't panic. It was confusion. My brother started asking questions, small ones at first, clarifying ones, the kind that sounds casual but carries an edge of uncertainty. He mentioned delays, follow-ups, requests for information he thought had already been settled. I listened. I didn't react. When systems begin to respond, they do so quietly. They don't accuse. They request. They verify. They ask for alignment. That's when momentum starts to slow. I noticed the shift in how people spoke to him. Professionals who had once deferred now asked for confirmation. Assumptions turned into checklists. Verbal assurances were no longer enough. And still, no one confronted him. That's the thing about procedural consequence. It doesn't feel personal at first. It feels administrative. My brother mentioned that a routine review was taking longer than expected. He laughed it off, said these things happen. I nodded sympathetically, said nothing. Inside, I felt neither satisfaction nor fear, just steadiness. The family sensed something was off before they understood why. Plans that had been discussed casually were suddenly uncertain. Timelines stretched. Conversations ended with, "We'll see," instead of, "It's done." Loss often announces itself before its cause is known. My brother grew more attentive to me, especially. He checked in more often, asked what I thought, included me in conversations I hadn't been part of before. That change might have felt validating once. Now it felt instructive. People notice you when they need you. I responded politely, calmly. I didn't withhold anything. I didn't reveal anything either. I let the process speak. When my mother asked why things felt unsettled again, I told her the truth, carefully, that some details were being reviewed, that it was about clarity, not conflict, that she didn't need to worry. And she didn't, because for the first time since waking up, things were happening for her, not around her. My brother began expressing frustration, not at me, but at the situation. He complained about red tape, about inefficiency, about how difficult it was to get anything done once people started second-guessing. I listened without comment. What he was experiencing wasn't injustice. It was an oversight. Oversight feels like resistance when you're used to operating without it. The shift reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Conversations grew more careful. Language is more precise. Certainty evaporated. And still, no confrontation. That absence unsettled him more than anger ever could have, because anger gives you something to push against. Silence, backed by process, leaves nowhere to place blame. I watched him try to regain footing by asserting confidence, by reminding people of what had already been done, by framing questions as unnecessary. But once a system begins to re-examine itself, confidence alone doesn't stop it. The consequences weren't dramatic. No shouting, no accusations, just a gradual rebalancing of control. What had once moved quickly now moved deliberately. And what moved deliberately could be questioned. The family didn't yet understand what was happening. They only felt the shift, the loss of certainty, the discomfort of unresolved things. That was the beginning, not of punishment, but of recalibration. And recalibration, once started, doesn't stop because someone is uncomfortable. It stops only when alignment is restored. By the time my brother realized something was truly wrong, the window for control had already closed. At first, he tried to fix things the way he always had, by explaining, by reframing, by reassuring everyone that the delays were procedural and temporary. He spoke with the same confidence that had carried him before, but this time it didn't land. Because confidence only works when no one is checking. Requests turned into requirements. Conversations turned into documentation. What had once been handled with a phone call now required written confirmation. That's when urgency entered his voice. Not panic, not yet, but irritation. The kind that comes when momentum is interrupted, and you don't understand why. He asked me directly, one evening, whether I knew what was going on. I met his eyes and said, truthfully, "They're just making sure everything aligns with Mom's wishes." It was the most neutral sentence I could offer, and it unsettled him more than an accusation would have. Because alignment implies the possibility of misalignment. He pushed back gently at first, said, of course, everything aligned, that he had acted responsibly, that no one had questioned his authority before. That last part slipped out without intention. Before, I didn't comment on it. As the review progressed, the questions became sharper. Timelines mattered. Capacity mattered. Benefit mattered. The assumption that everything had been done in good faith was no longer enough. Good faith still had to be demonstrated. My brother tried to retroactively solidify things, to gather supporting statements, to frame decisions as mutual, to emphasize urgency that hadn't existed. But systems don't work backward cleanly. Once a process has begun, attempts to steer it become visible. That visibility is what he underestimated. I could see the moment he understood that reassurance wouldn't restore control, that whatever was happening wasn't something he could smooth over with tone or confidence. It was too late to fix it quietly. The family began to sense the gravity of it, not in explosive ways, but in hushed conversations, in concerned looks, in questions no one had asked before. Why was the house sold so quickly? Why hadn't Mom been told? Why did things feel so final while she was still unconscious? Those questions didn't come from me. That was the point. When truth surfaces organically, it carries weight. When it's forced, it can be dismissed. My brother grew defensive, not outwardly aggressive, but tight, controlled. He spoke carefully, choosing words like shields. And I remained calm, not cold, not distant, calm. That calm, I could tell, unnerved him, because he expected emotion from me. Anger, hurt, accusation. Emotion would have confirmed his narrative, that this was a family dispute, a misunderstanding between siblings. But this wasn't about us. It was about a process that had crossed from efficient to inappropriate. By the time my mother was formally informed of what had happened, the conversation was supported by context, documentation, and options. She wasn't confronted with chaos. She was presented with clarity. That mattered. She didn't explode. She didn't collapse. She asked questions. She expressed disappointment, not rage, but sadness. And sadness, when justified, is heavier than anger. My brother couldn't fix that. He apologized. To her, not to me. He explained. He justified. He framed his actions as protective. She listened quietly. Then she said something simple. I wish I had been asked. That sentence ended everything. There was nothing left to repair through explanation. The harm wasn't dramatic, but it was final. Trust, once bypassed, doesn't return on demand. By the time my brother understood that, the system had already done what it does best: slow things down, reevaluate, and redirect authority. Not as punishment, as a correction. And corrections don't care how confident you were when you made the mistake. They care whether you were allowed to make it at all. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly calm. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no dramatic declarations. Just the three of us in my mother's living room. Now smaller, quieter, stripped of the certainty it once held. My brother sat across from me, hands folded, posture controlled. He looked tired in a way that confidence couldn't cover anymore. Not defeated, just exposed. He didn't start with anger. He started with an explanation. He talked about pressure, about responsibility, about how quickly everything had happened. He said he was trying to protect our mother, that he thought he was doing the right thing. I let him finish. That was new. In the past, I would have softened the moment, redirected, assured him that I understood, that it was okay, that no one blamed him. This time I stayed quiet, not as a tactic, not as a restraint, but as respect for the truth that didn't need decoration. When he finally paused, he looked at me and asked, "Why didn't you say anything?" It wasn't an accusation. It was confusion. I answered honestly, slowly. "I did," I said, "just not the way you expected." He frowned slightly. I could see him searching for the version of me he was used to, the agreeable one, the buffer, the quiet supporter. That version wasn't there anymore. I didn't raise my voice, I continued. I didn't argue. I didn't try to embarrass you. I paid attention. And when I understood what had happened, I chose to act in a way that protected Mom without turning this into a fight. My mother listened without interrupting. My brother said that if I had concerns, I should have come to him first. I nodded. I would have, I said, if there had been space for that. But every time I asked for clarity, I was told not to worry, that it was handled, that it was done. He opened his mouth to respond, then stopped, because he knew it was true. I didn't accuse him of bad intentions. I didn't list his mistakes. I didn't dramatize the impact. I simply said, the house was sold while she couldn't speak, and by the time she woke up, it was already gone. That matters. Silence followed, not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that settles when everyone understands what can't be undone. My brother looked at our mother. She didn't look angry. She looked disappointed and tired. I know you thought you were helping, she said, but help without asking doesn't feel like help. That was it. No verdict, no punishment, just truth. Spoken calmly with no need to escalate. The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with clarity. Roles had shifted. Authority had been redistributed. Not dramatically, but permanently. My brother nodded. He didn't argue anymore. He didn't defend. He just nodded. And in that moment, I understood something important. Calm isn't the absence of strength. It's often the proof of it. There was nothing left for me to say. I had already said it, through timing, through restraint, through choosing process over performance. And that was enough. After everything settled, people expected me to change. They expected anger to surface late, or resentment to linger quietly in the background. They expected distance, or bitterness, or some visible transformation that would signal how deeply things had affected me. None of that happened. What changed wasn't my temperament, it was my position. I no longer felt the need to explain myself to acceptance. I no longer softened my words to make others comfortable. And I no longer mistook calmness for obligation. The most surprising thing was how natural this version of me felt. I hadn't become colder, I had become clearer. Conversations shifted subtly. People asked my opinion and waited for the answer. Not because I demanded space, but because I no longer gave it away reflexively. Silence, when you stop filling it, has weight. My relationship with my brother didn't end, it changed. There was less assumption, less certainty, more caution. Not fear, awareness. He no longer spoke for the family without checking. He no longer framed decisions as settled before they were discussed. That shift didn't come from confrontation. It came from consequence. And consequence, when it's quiet, is often the most lasting teacher. My mother recovered steadily. We talked more openly about what she wanted, about how she wanted decisions handled if anything ever happened again. Everything was written down, shared, transparent. She told me once, I didn't know how much you were holding until you stopped. That stayed with me. For years, I had believed my value came from being easy, from absorbing tension, from smoothing edges. I thought strength looked like endurance. I was wrong. Strength looks like discernment, like knowing when to stay silent and when silence has done its work. I still don't raise my voice. I still don't seek the center of the room. I still listen more than I speak. But I no longer disappear. I've learned that being underestimated is only dangerous if you believe the underestimate yourself. Otherwise, it's a position, one that gives you time, space, perspective. Quiet dominance doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It operates through consistency, clarity, and an understanding of systems, not just people. I don't regret how I handled things, not because the outcome favored me, but because it protected what mattered without destroying what didn't need to be destroyed. No bridges were burned, but boundaries were drawn, and boundaries, once established, change everything. Today, when I look back on who I was to them, I don't feel shame. I feel understanding. That version of me did what she knew how to do at the time. This version knows more, and she doesn't need to prove it. There's a particular kind of injustice that never makes noise. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't leave bruises or broken doors. It moves through paperwork, assumptions, and well-meaning explanations. It hides behind phrases like, I was just trying to help, and someone had to decide. And because it looks reasonable, it's often left unchallenged. For a long time, I thought justice had to look dramatic to be real. I thought it required confrontation, exposure, or some visible reckoning. What I learned instead is that justice can be quiet and still be complete. No one was publicly shamed in my story. No one was destroyed. There was no winner standing over a loser. What changed was alignment. My mother regained her voice. Not loudly, not angrily, but clearly. Decisions returned to where they belonged. Authority was recalibrated, and a system that had drifted too far in one direction was brought back into balance. That mattered more to me than an apology. I also learned something uncomfortable about myself. How easy it had been to mistake being agreeable for being ethical. To believe that staying calm was the same as staying neutral. It isn't. Silence can protect peace, but it can also protect harm if it's unexamined. The difference is intention. When silence comes from fear, it erodes you. When it comes from clarity, it can become power. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about refusing to abandon yourself in order to keep things comfortable. It's about understanding when process matters more than performance, and when patience is stronger than reaction. I don't tell this story to warn you about family, or brothers, or legal authority. I tell it because many people listening will recognize the role I once played. The reliable one, the calm one, the one who doesn't need to be involved. If that's you, I want you to hear this clearly. Being underestimated is not a weakness unless you internalize it. You don't have to announce your boundaries to make them real. You don't have to explode to be taken seriously, and you don't have to perform pain for it to be valid. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is pay attention, prepare quietly, and act when it actually matters. The world teaches us to equate loudness with strength, but some of the most decisive shifts happen without an audience. This story didn't end with applause. It ended with equilibrium, and that for me was enough. Before I go, I want to leave you with one question, not rhetorical, not dramatic, just honest. Have you ever stayed silent long enough to realize your silence was no longer protecting others, but preparing you? If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Not just about what happened, but about the roles we accept, the ones we outgrow, and the moment we realize we don't have to play them anymore. That's where real change usually begins.